Great. Lovely to be here, and hello to everyone. I'm going to, as it says, talk about local food and the public plate. Thanks for the introduction. Tony Burnett told me that to do two things. One, introduce myself properly, so I'm going to do that. And the other was not to put too many words on the screen, so I've tried not to do that either. Okay, so this is my so-called career in 7 slides, and it kind of, I wanted to sort of make some connections between what I've been doing for the last 30 odd years and local food and why it's so important to me. I actually started off in local government, like many of you, as a town planner, a short and not very distinguished career, most of which was spent in the building you can see on the top left there, which was the old city planning and development department in Wood Street in Cardiff. It's been knocked down now. It did strike me at the time that I was there that, you know, if you were planning on getting enthusiasm for planning Cardiff, that this wasn't the ideal building to start it in. But towards the end of my career, as I say, short-lived career as a town planner, I started running restaurants, initially with my wife's family in Copenhagen, just down the road from here, and I've been doing that for the last 30 years. And the second picture you can see at the top there is our current establishment, Wright's Food Emporium. And I guess that you know, my connection with local food has largely come through the restaurant trade and our relationship with suppliers. You know, we started in the 90s, and arguably it was easier to get the kind of produce that we need back in the 90s than it is now. There were a lot more small farms. There were a lot more people producing secondary production, you know, in terms of cheese and milk, etc., that you could get direct from the farms or from close by. And of course, we've lost some of those facilities, abattoirs, small abattoirs in particular. So it's actually in some ways more difficult now than it was then. Though we have great suppliers, all our meat and comes locally, as does the dairy products and most of the veg that we have. The other thing, you know, I kind of got into restaurants because I liked eating. It seemed like a reasonable career ambition. The other thing I liked to do was write, and towards the end of the 90s, I got the opportunity to work as a restaurant inspector for the AA restaurant guide. So that basically meant traveling around the country, sitting on your ass, basically being fed food at someone else's expense, and paid to do it. And there was a car, so you know, it was a good gig, really. I think I had about 2,000 meals in the 7 years I was there. I ended up editing the AA restaurant guide, and that was even better then because I could choose the restaurants I went to because I was in charge. So did that for quite a while. It was an incredible experience. And again, even at that point in time, the importance of local food on the plate in terms of, you know, when you go to an area, you want to eat the food that comes from there, you know, even if it's not the style necessarily, the content of it. And that was already becoming a big force in terms of restaurants in the UK back in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I left that job in 2003, and one of the things I went on to do was, as been mentioned, I worked on all the UK Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares. That was over a period of 10 years. There were 36 UK episodes. One of the reasons that my job was to kind of go in there before Gordon did and look at the restaurants and work out what was good and bad and what we might do to change them. One of the reasons that the UK ones came to an end is because we were basically saying the same things over and over again, which was like shorten the menu, use local ingredients. None of which helps if the guy in the kitchen can't cook. But it was a great experience, and we stopped doing those in 2014. In the meantime, I also did some freelance writing. I wrote a book called Tough Cookies, which came out in 2004. And I also did, as has been mentioned, some broadcasting, quite a lot of radio, which I still do. and some TV. And the book you can see there was from the BBC Wales series that I did, where I farmed for a few years. So again, gave me a real kind of contact with where the produce comes from, and a better understanding of everything that's involved in putting good food on the plate. In the last 10 years, I've spent an awful lot more time sort of working on, I guess, public policy issues, particularly in relation to food, particularly in education, but public policy as a whole, and with a Wales specific focus, because I feel and have felt for years that very strongly that we have an amazing food offering in Wales, or we potentially have an amazing food offering in Wales, and we don't always make the most of it. There are great opportunities for us if we could be bolder and a bit more imaginative about what we do. And the final picture there is Lampeter, the University of Wales, Trinity St David, where I'm sort of based out of now, working with the university on developing food education in the region, food policy. And I have this is like the ultimate imposter syndrome, isn't it? I'm now a professor of practice. I mean, I feel like I've done nothing there are real professors out there who must really despise professors of practice, I imagine. So those were the slides that accompanied that long rambling talk about my dismal career. Okay, so yeah, I'm here to talk about local food and the public plate anyway, and particularly in respect of some work that I've been doing with Carmarthenshire County Council and the Public Service Board over the past 18 months, really, most of during COVID, where we had some money from the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund in order to specifically look at putting local food on the public plate and what that would mean. I wrote quite a long report on that is now with the council and with Welsh Government. Now, one of the things I felt about this from the start was that we kind of been here before, that it's always been an ambition, it's always been something that's been talked about, but it's not something that really has developed very much in reality. And I think what's really important is that what was really important was we went back to the first principles of why are we doing this, because for me it's a massive thing. It's powerful and can mean enormous change, but in order to recognize that and realize that, we had to look at all the parts, because the money came from the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund. So there we have the first symbol. The money is a big part of it. Economy is a massive part of it. Bringing life back into local communities by spending public money in the area. Secondary production in agriculture is minimal in Wales. We retain very little of the value of what we produce, because most of the processing of it in the value chain happens outside of Wales. So most of the value is realised further up the chain, and as little as 8% is retained of the added value is retained within Wales. So clearly we can all see how buying food locally could function in terms of improving the rural economy. And the rural economy is not just about money either. It's about what happens to our rural communities and what has been happening, and what those of us who live down here witnessed over in my case, the last 30 years, which is, how there's far less economic activity in rural areas, in towns and villages, generally speaking. We've seen, some of the core of communities has disappeared, and that has effects on everything from informal social care right the way through to the Welsh language, for instance. So the money part of it is where the instigation for the project came from, but it's not the full picture, because climate. So climate, for instance, in relation to food, is a massive issue. Around about 10% of emissions are created by agriculture. But probably in many ways more significantly, at least 30% of emissions are created by food production. So the way our food system works, the way we produce things, is a key part of the situation we're in relation to climate change. And again, it should be a driver by why we want for spending public money more carefully on food, in order to fulfill those ambitions of fighting climate change. And it's not just climate change there either, it's biodiversity and nature, because without doubt, the UK is one of the one of the nations that's most denuded of its wildlife in the past 5 decades. We reckon, I think since the war, it's estimated we've lost about half of the wildlife that we had, and a lot of that is down to farming and the way that we farmed. So again, our food production is key. How we produce food is key in meeting ambitions to bring back biodiversity. I want to make a point there, because I've mentioned farming as this is not about criticising farmers. Farmers, the way that we farm in Wales and the way that we farm in the UK, and indeed across the world, is largely a result of government policy. Farmers haven't chosen necessarily to intensify. They've been encouraged to, and the economic framework that they operate in has encouraged that consolidation. Another major driver of why we need to consider where we're spending our public money on food is health. In Wales, we have some of the most frightening figures in relation to diet-related disease in Western Europe. We spend, for instance, £500 million a year at the moment treating type 2 diabetes in Wales. And that works out, just that one thing, just treating it, works out at a massive £160 per year for every man, woman and child in Wales. And that's before you look at a string of other diet-related diseases, the days lost off work and the suffering that causes. So, we have a massive problem with health, and at the root of that, there's a big problem with diet. So again, when we're spending public money on food, then that should be as part of the agenda, clearly. And finally here, I kept this to symbols. Tony didn't want any words. So finally here, that represents security, food security. And I think that's one of the issues that's going to rise to the surface over the next coming months and years. And it already has started to, because of the interruptions we've seen to global food supply in recent months. And those are relatively small shocks to the system compared to what we might anticipate. So, absence of things on supermarket shelves, the inability to provide school meals in some instances in the last few months is nothing to what we might see. We will see actually coming further down the line in terms of climate change, crop failures, disruption to the global food system, and we have to place in that context the fact that the UK only produces 50% of the food that we need. So it's not a huge leap to see a situation in a decade's time, 2 decades' time, where we can't feed ourselves. So if that's not a policy consideration now, then it surely ought to be. Now, those to me are some of the key drivers in terms of why we would want to think about putting local food on the public plate, because although public money is not enough to transform our food system, it's often said that the total spend on food in Wales from the public purse is only equivalent to what's spent at Cardiff, Culverhouse Cross, Tesco's in 1 year. But that is an awful lot of food. And the reality of it is that public money, public procurement does have the ability to have a catalytic effect on how we shape the food system and the changes that we need to make going forward. But in order to do that, the way that we spend it has to have regard to all those things. So it's no good just saying, well, we're going to change procurement, we're going to spend money in the local area. Actually, in some ways, we do a lot of that already. In Carmarthenshire, for instance, I think around about 85% of the money is spent directly in the local area, but that's with wholesalers. Where that food then comes from, you're down to a very, very small percentage. 1 or 2% of the food that's actually consumed is produced in the local area. So it's through using that tool, we can achieve more than the objectives of just putting the money back into the rural economy. If we're buying food that is sustainably produced, that's going to have an impact on our efforts to fight climate change and the loss of biodiversity. If it's good, nutritious food, naturally produced, again, it's going to be better for health in our schools and in our hospitals. And we have this imperative, I feel, of food security coming down the line. Is like, how are we going to be able to feed ourselves in the context of what maybe we expect to be major disruptions to the global food supply chain? And to me, that's really important that we have that context, because those are the drivers and those are the things that should give us the energy to want to make a change here, and be using public money for the public good. So local food and the public, where are we now and where are we going? Well, we face a number of challenges, and one of the biggest is that we currently, what we produce and what we consume on the public plate are two very different things. So at the top there, you can see lamb and beef, a lot of which we produce in Wales and in South Wales specifically. And yet our public plate is almost entirely made up of chicken. That's the great majority, and then pork. Now, neither of these things do we produce in any great quantity. Arguably, chicken is the least sustainable of meats in the way that it's produced. And, some of you will be aware that there's been a huge charge towards industrial chicken production in parts of Wales. But the chicken that we do buy is generally not from Wales. In fact, it's from as far away as Thailand as you might expect. As far as pork is concerned, again, Wales is not a large producer of pork. We have about 30,000 pigs in Wales. There are 3 million in England, and there's about 300,000 in Scotland. So the tradition of pig production in Wales was never an intensive one. It was all about having one in your backyard. Maybe we should encourage that going forward. But the point here is that there's no correlation between what we produce and what we consume on the public plate. And it hasn't been a driver of setting the menus for what we consume on the public plate. Vegetables, well, we require, say, for instance, in Copenhagen, about 200 tons of vegetables to fulfill the public plate in 1 year, but we don't produce any of any note. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, and Pembrokeshire, quite a lot of potatoes down there, but in relation to the demand, and also in relation to what we used to produce in Wales, because you don't have to go back very far to find that there were market gardens all over southwest Wales, and that we were producing a great variety of veg and indeed fruit, and we don't do that at the moment. So again, the challenge there is at a point where we need to get more vegetables onto the plate for health reasons as much as anything else. We're not actually producing any. In fact, I think we produce, all the vegetables produced in Wales were the only veg for public consumption, it would only give us about a quarter of the 5 a day per person in Wales. So we just don't produce that hugely at the moment. And then finally, the other kind of big barrier is price. And this is one of the big questions in procurement, because at the moment, most of it is price. 70% is price. Now that's changing, and there's great work going on this across Wales. It's not just in Carmarthenshire. There's great work going on in Caerphilly, for instance, and other places. But the reality of it is that the current situation is we make most of our purchasing decisions on price. But what we pay for and what we get are two different things, because price doesn't reflect the full cost of what we buy. Because if we're buying the wrong things and they're having a detrimental environmental impact, if we're buying the wrong things and they're having a poor impact on health, if we're buying the wrong things and they're not putting money back into the local economy, then they're costing us an awful lot more than we think. And, you know, that is one of the key things that we have to square if we're going to move forward with public procurement on food in Wales. And as I say, there's an awful lot of work going on that, and there's some good understanding of what needs to be done. I'm going to attempt to, here we are. Okay. So those are kind of all the barriers. And I think I just sat in on a session here that those of you online won't have seen, but it was all about imagination and bringing imagination into the workplace. And when I look at all the barriers that we have in terms of putting public food, sort of local food on the public plate and moving towards that vision, I think the biggest barrier, the biggest barrier of all is cynicism, a lack of belief. When I've talked to people involved in procurement in various parts of Wales, you know, the first thing they talk about is, well, we've kind of been here before. We've heard all this talk. We didn't take it forward. It was a lot of extra work for us. And we ended up with, you know, only a token effort in terms of the eventual outcome. And I think that's sometimes because the way that we go about this is we look for the cracks of light between the procedure and bureaucratic barriers rather than trying to think of where we want to end up. You know, for me, I can imagine a position in Wales in 10, 20 years' time with the vast majority of the food that we serve on the public plate comes from the local area and comes from Wales. There is no reason that we can't get to that position. It's sometimes the hardest thing is just to convince people that we need to aim for the big picture, that we can see that world, a world in which, for instance, kids go into school in the morning, they know what's coming for lunch, they know where it was produced. Lunch is part of the curriculum. You can teach climate change through lunch, you can teach science through lunch. Food that is nutritious, that gets kids in the habit of eating good food, sitting around a table. Those same kids being instructed in cooking so that when they leave school, they have the skills to make this food themselves. And, you know, we know that in relation to diet-related disease, the poorest parts of society are the ones that buy the most highly processed foods. And part of that is because we no longer have the autonomy and the skills that we used to have in terms of making food for ourselves. My belief is that that intervention should take place in the school. You're probably wondering what this slide is about. Well, this is really, you know, what would nirvana, some of you will get that, what would it look like? Well, it would look like the Little Mermaid. It would look like Copenhagen is the idea here. Now, the reason I say Copenhagen is because when we were doing the Carmarthenshire project, we did quite a lot of work with the House of Food in Carmarthenshire, in Copenhagen, because they have an inspirational story to tell. And I think theirs is a story of liberating imagination and believing that they could get things done. And they had rather remarkable outcomes. Now, in Copenhagen, the plan was in the early 2000s, they decided that they needed to change the nature of the public plate for all the reasons we've talked about, for climate change, for the local economy, for food security, and for health. And they decided that the best way that they could do that at the time, because the accreditation was already there and it was an easy thing to latch onto, was look at putting organic food on the public plate. Now, when I say that, normally, you know, you kind of, when you talk about organic food, everybody thinks very expensive. But the Copenhagen example is quite instructive in that respect. So they actually set themselves a target of reaching 90% organic on the public plate. That's schools, hospitals, care homes, other institutions by 2015. And that was back in, I think, 2002. And they achieved 89% in 2015. And there's a remarkable change. The drivers, as I say, were the same. You know, in relation to, you know, the key policy issues. As far as price was concerned, it's quite a revelatory kind of story, because when they completed the project, or when they got to 2015 and, you know, say 89% of the food was organic on the public plate, the reality was that actually it was costing the same as it was, you know, with allowing for inflation in 2002. because of the other measures they'd brought in. So they changed the nature of the public plate. They used less meat, they used more vegetables. But they did spend £45 million in the meantime. And they spent that £45 million on putting the structure in place in order so that schools could cook properly, so that staff were properly trained. They very much raised the status of working in school and hospital kitchens, so that it was something you could be really proud of, working with the most incredible ingredients as well. So big change in sort of job satisfaction there. And that allowed them to get to that position where they, as I say, didn't spend any more now. They don't spend any more now on the public plate than they spent back in 2002, but everything is organic. Now, there is a caveat to that, which is they started out from a place where they were spending twice as much on school meals as we are in the first place. So we can't pretend that we don't still need to have that argument. But in terms of fulfilling that vision, I think it's really instructive as to how you can get to somewhere that you may have thought was unrealistic, if there's that joint vision and that imagination. And again, I think this is really important in terms of public policy and where we are now in Wales. We tend to work in silos very often, even though we're a small nation, 3 million with our own government. And that seems to me that when we do that, we're failing to use our real strength, which is the fact that we should be small, communication should be good, there should be less overlap, less duplication. But I know from all the conversations that I have, and I'm sure those that are in the room and those that are watching online will have, similar experiences. In the food world, I go to lots and lots of meetings, and I nearly always discover some initiative or some project that I'm not aware of relating to, say, local food or nutrition or whatever. We have to do a much better job of that, and we have to be much more inclusive as well. It needs to be a joint vision, and this goes all the way back to, I guess, procurement in itself can't be looked at without looking at the food system as a whole. And there's been we've taken some step forward on that in recent weeks. There've been lots of people pressing for an overall an overarching strategy for food and farming in Wales, saying we can't look at one area of this, say nutrition, without looking at the environmental impacts. We can't look at the effect on farms and the rural economy without looking at biodiversity. Everything has to be looked at together, and we need a plan. Food, naturally, you would think food would be in the driving seat, because what else is it? We need shelter, food, water, oxygen. So you'd think that food would be in the front seat of policy, when it quite often sits in the back seat as a consideration in other policy areas. So that kind of overarching vision is really important. And 2 weeks ago, a bill that was introduced by an individual member was successful in getting through the Senate, and that asks for a food strategy. There's a lot of work to do on that, but it's a big step forward potentially. And Welsh Government itself has the community food strategy in the programme for government, though we don't exactly know what that's going to be yet. Similarly, in terms of steps forward, and something that's really going to invigorate the debate and the work on public procurement, is the agreement on universal free school meals for primary level, which came out of the cooperation agreement between Plaid and Labour over the weekend. Because all the things that I've talked about today in terms of the tasks that public food could fulfill, if we think about it in the right way, are applicable to primary school food. In particular, in the cooperation agreement, the two parties talk about the transformational effect that free school meals in primary school could have in terms of nutrition, health, etc. That's only going to happen if we're putting the right food on the public plate. It's not going to happen if we continue to follow the patterns that we are at the moment. And that's really interesting. So where do we go from here? Well, in Commandantshire at the moment, we've got a series of recommendations that we need to take forward. So there are some specific projects and pilots that might happen. But also, I think perhaps most importantly, we need to start the work of looking at how do we redesign the public plate. Because at the moment, as I've said earlier, what we ask for and what we can provide in Wales are two completely different things. So there's some short-term wins on that. I mean, if you look at the amount of lamb consumed on the public plate in Wales, it's tiny. It's absolutely minute. You know, people will say, well, it's too expensive. But the reality of it is there are ways of serving lamb at current prices that we could get that into schools and into hospitals. And there is no reason we shouldn't embark on that. That's something we already have. Other things like vegetables in particular, it's going to be a period of transition. And I think this is, again, instructive in terms of what they did in Copenhagen, is that they had the nerve to say, we're going to make this 90% by 2015, back in 2002. And when you question them about that, you know, how did you come up with 90%? I mean, it wasn't that scientific. It was like, well, that's where we want to be, so let's make it happen. And I think that, again, we need to take similar approaches. We need to be ambitious, and we need to be setting the pace in Wales for other parts of the UK. So redesigning the public plate is really important. School menus at the moment don't reflect, you know, we just reflect the things that we produced. So we have to make those more seasonal and local. But in order for that to happen, we have to upskill the workforce as well. So there's a lot of work to do. And you know, but these are things that are all achievable if we have the ambition, and you know, if we're united in using our energy together to get there. So I guess that's really that's my message at the moment, is that, you know, we have this tool in Carmarthenshire. It's £5 million of money spent on food. We can make big changes. It's not enough to revolutionize the world and change the food system on its own. But when you look at catalyzing things like more horticulture through contracts and over a period of time, we have the ability to do that. And also the same kind of routes to market that we can establish with local food production that we would need for the public sector can serve the private sector as well, can serve commercial interests. We need cooperation amongst farmers, amongst growers. We need joint packaging facilities. We need distribution organised, etc., etc. So it's the same pattern for the public sector as the private sector. As I said at the start, I think the challenges are really enormous at the moment in almost all areas, you know, in our daily lives, but in public policy. But we stand at a real crossroads with food, and we will not have this opportunity again. This is the opportunity to change the future, to rewrite what we're doing. And at the moment, I think we're at least looking in the right direction. You know, the test for us now is whether we've got the confidence to set out on that road kind of as we begin to build it. So yeah, that's pretty much what I had to say. We have any am I taking questions in the room first of all? And
it's funny, Andrew, I don't know what you think, but we've got Simon for slightly longer than you online, I suppose. Do you want to maybe field some questions from the external audience first?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to read this one out. I'm not sure. Let me see where. It says from Andrea Saunders. She says, how do we make it easier for individuals who are keen to getting into edible horticulture to acquire land? Bit of a tough one.
No, it's a key one. Access to land is one of the biggest problems that we've got. There are some really imaginative schemes going on, and there's one in Powys, Monmouthshire, where they're trying to bring together, I think it's called 1200. I think it's based on doing 1200 acres. They're trying to bring together those that want to get into producing fruit and veg with farmers who've got land that they can lend to that purpose. I went out to see an example a few weeks ago where you know, the farmer's getting twice the rent that he would normally get for that piece of land. It makes economic sense for the people that are growing on it, and I think it was around about a hectare that they've got there, and you know, they're pretty much they are making a living out of that area of land after 18 months. So access to land is a big deal. I mean, one of the things I'm kind of interested in is they're talking about replacing council tax and business tax, and I wonder whether that's going to be a land valuation tax, which would also probably have the effect of suppressing land prices and rents over a period of time. But in the more immediate term, I think a lot of it is going to rely on cooperation between farmers and growers and seeing that opportunity. And as I say, the project that's going on in Powys is really good in that respect. I think the other opportunity is public land, public farms, local authority farms, of which there are still an enormous number. Again, in my view, is that they should be targeted at sustainable agriculture and with an emphasis on horticulture. And there are other areas of public land, both in rural communities, but in cities too, which could and should be used for growing. So, I appreciate it's a difficult thing to overcome, but there are opportunities out there, and I think matching up farmers with growers is one of the best of them.
Thanks, Simon. There's another one here, and actually you talked a little bit earlier on about the cynicism. When you're speaking to people, we've been here before and there was just token efforts. It's another one from Andrea, actually. She's saying, having spoken to a lot of livestock farmers in West Wales, they feel that public procurement just want to push the price down, and it's not viable for them. How do we overcome this and pay a good price?
Well, I mean, this comes down to social value as well. So one of the problems that we seem to have in government is not being, and this won't come as a surprise to anyone, is not being able to see the long term. So what we spend now and the effect that it has in the future should be part of the calculation, shouldn't it? And for instance, if we take school food, we've got this change that's happened in government, that could have generationally, that could have a profound effect on how much we're spending on diet-related disease in the NHS. I mean, look, just using that as an example for what Angela's saying, we spend £50 million in total on school food in Wales. We spend £500 million every year on treating type 2 diabetes. So, that equation, you only got to knock 10% off that, and you've got, you can double your spending on school food. And I think the same applies to what this question. We have to be rewarding farmers for doing things properly. We have to recognise in our purchasing that the money's going back into the local economy, and that will have beneficial effects for rural communities, and will cut down lots of spending in other ways. Same thing applies to the environment. If we don't if our countryside is cleaner and our water is cleaner, then we have to do less work on it. And in terms of climate change, well, those costs are going to be enormous. And so if we're not doing our bit to fight that, how does that equation work? So a lot of this does come down to the technical bits of procurement and how we incorporate social value into that. And I think that's also linked in farming to the proposed changes to farmers' payments, which eventually will be reliant on the public good outcomes, and particularly in relation to the environment. We have to learn ways of measuring those as well. So that it's the same question both for public procurement in local authorities, how do you measure that? And it's the same question for Welsh Government in terms of farm payments, how are they going to measure those outcomes? And I think we need to find relatively simple ways of doing that, because otherwise it'll all get weighed down in bureaucracy. So I hope that answers the question to an extent. I also think that that we have to, one of the things that's happened over the past few years is that we've got a big divide with farmers, particularly livestock farmers, where they feel like they're cast as the enemy. Their livelihoods and their place in the rural economy has to be part of the solution. We shouldn't be treating those things separately. So it's all very well saying, yeah, your payments are going to be based on environmental outcomes, but what about routes to market? Where are their markets going to be? What is the food market going to look like in the future? So, again, the public purse can be used to underpin some of that change.
Thanks, Simon. I guess a lot of this seems to come back to policy, and it seems to me, at least, that the issue is budgets. Local authorities spend money on food, school dinners, and NHS have got budgets to deliver health. It's a real challenge, really, isn't it? And I'm just wondering, do you think that Welsh Government needs to be more directional in terms of public procurement?
Yeah, I do, and I think first of all it has to come from the ground up. So I think all this good work that's going on across Wales, that needs to be shared and coordinated. We've not been very good at doing that in any policy sector, I would say, or the ones that I've been involved with. So I think that's really important. I think that the food strategy, whatever it turns out to be, the food and farming strategy, we really desperately need that for this reason, because you can't do these things without joining them up. The problem is that if you then intervene in one area and you haven't considered the others, you end up having unintended consequences. So, which is basically what's happened with farming over the last 50 years. The idea is like, let's produce more food more cheaply, but look at what the consequences of that have been. So, yeah, I do think more direction, but I don't think it has to be top-down direction. I think it has to be more, Welsh Government's job here, in my view, is to convene and produce spaces in which people can imagine solutions to this. And again, we haven't been so great at doing that in the past, I don't think.
Thanks very much, Simon. That's all from us. Back to you in the room, Tony, if you want to take questions in the room.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Thank you.
So I was interested. You mentioned about the command as an example, and we know that we can eat food today, so that's not going to change in the future. But schools in particular, the amount we procure as a council through wholesalers in Copenhagen. So I suppose it comes back to again, procurement policy and everything. But if there was a commitment from the authority to say that we need that food locally sourced, locally produced, do you think that would change the wholesalers effectively? Because as you said, we may be going to local wholesalers, but very little of that food comes from them.
I mean, yeah. So,
did you get that question, Andrew? Did you pick up on Ian's question there? It's around, do you think the wholesalers can be influenced by public policy?
Thanks, Tony. Worth reiterating, but we didn't catch much of it, but thanks for that.
So Ian was asking about wholesalers and where they source their food, and I would say that the big wholesaler down here is Castle Howell. And they've been involved in this conversation all the way through. And to be fair to them, they've got a very good track record of wanting to encourage local produce. But obviously, they're working to pricing and availability. And at the moment, the biggest issue is actually availability. We don't have these products. So, if we're talking about starting at the base level, then the first thing is redesigning the school menu over a period of time, so that it's much more closely aligned to what is local and what is seasonal, both existing in terms of things like lamb and dairy, and potential in terms of horticulture, fruit and veg. So I think it's really important that we take into account existing distribution systems and the people that are already doing the job. I mean, Castle Howell have had a very hard time, as lots of us in hospitality have had over the last 18 months. And I think without them, a lot of the moving of Welsh produce around, particularly in hospitality venues, simply wouldn't happen. So they're a really important cog in this. But we do need to, we've got other big barriers in terms of the production system. I mean, abattoirs is a key one. I mean, it's, we've legislated ourselves into a position where small abattoirs are largely not viable anymore. And when you do that, you're putting the farmer in the position of having very few people to sell to. And you lose control locally and within Wales. So those are things that structurally Welsh Government should be looking at, but we should be looking at on a local level as well.
see how we do the creameries.
The same with creameries. Yeah, Ian's just mentioned creameries. It's the same thing with creameries as well. I mean, we do a little bit better in terms of buying Welsh milk for the public consumption, but still a lot of that is processed outside of Wales now and comes back in. So again, you know, we've made strategic. We've done things for the, you know, what seemed perhaps the best reasons over the last sort of 20 years or so, and well, in fact, going back to the Second World War. But the reality of it is that because we haven't taken a holistic view and because we've been focused on price and not value, we've ended up in a situation where we're paying for the cheapness in other regards, and we're paying very, very heavily. Now we've got a choice to go on doing that. And it's not one that I want to contemplate, or we've got a choice of making a more considered approach to how we purchase going forward. Anything else? Anyone?
Yeah, I did have a question. You said earlier on that we produce more lamb and beef, but we actually eat chicken and pork. Is there a way we can change that?
Yeah, asking about we produce more lamb and beef than we do chicken and pork, and can we change that? Yeah, I think that we can change that. I mean, the quality of the chicken and pork that we're buying is generally pretty shocking. I mean, you know, without talking specifically about any particular council, there are plenty of instances that you can look at across Wales where chicken is coming from Thailand, perhaps via the Netherlands. The reason it goes into the Netherlands is because that's where it has water pumped into it. And this is then ending up on our public plate. Now, look at that whole chain. You know, the final product, you know, only barely resembles something that once lived. The nutritional value is going to be affected hugely by that. The point about nutrition here is that we don't understand it. You know, we talk about 5 a day and all these are important things, but the reality of it is when you talk to those people working in nutrition and academics, they say that the more that we learn, the more we realize we don't know in terms of the role of micronutrients and how food interacts with the microbiome, our gut bacteria, etc., etc. What we should know, and this is a really interesting point about Copenhagen, is that when it came to justifying their spending on the basis of nutrition, the evidence wasn't there to say that organic food is better for you. There is some evidence, but it's not really ever been studied, and that's partly because we don't really understand nutrition anyway. And so I said to them, well, how did you justify it in nutritional terms? And they said, well, we just decided that was the one area in which common sense tells us that nature knows best. And I thought, yeah, that's you know, if you can get that sort of thinking into your public policy, then great. It's pretty hard to argue that with politicians and some senior civil servants. But going back to what you said about lamb and beef, yeah, I mean, look, I think that the amount of meat eaten is likely to diminish anyway, for, you know, reasons related to climate, nature, and health. I'm not recommending, by the way, that we don't eat meat, but we all know that we've gone, probably most of us, a situation in our lifetimes where meat has gone from being something we had to have a lot of respect for, and we ate sometimes, to something that we buy so cheaply, you know, £3 chicken, that people feel very easy about throwing it away again. Now that isn't viable in anyone's language, so that's going to change anyway. And some of this is all about managing transition. If we don't get ahead of the game, it'll be forced upon us. I think in terms of the short term, I'd really like to get more lamb on the public plate, because actually, you know, particularly in the form of mince, lamb needn't be that expensive, and you don't need to use a lot of it either. And it really upsets me to think that, you know, what are we known for here? Can you imagine going to France and you know, and not seeing the local food on the public plate? And I mean, it is on the public plate in France, Italy too, and it just seems extraordinary to me that, you know, there we are producing all this lamb, only 5% of which is consumed in Wales, and it isn't on the public plate. I did a back of an envelope calculation a while ago, And I reckoned that if we served lamb once a week in all our schools and hospitals, it would double the consumption in Wales. Now, that would only bring it to 10% of what we produce, but nevertheless, it would be good to see that. So I think real opportunity with lamb. We do serve some Welsh beef on the public plate in Wales, but not an awful lot. And again, a lot of this is down to the way our kitchens work as well. It's the food that we buy, we call it cheap food, but it's actually not that cheap. And that's partly because we need it all year round because the menus don't change. So can you imagine a situation in which the menus could change? You imagine a situation in which when there's plenty of something, we use more of it because it's cheaper. There's none of that flexibility in procurement at the moment. But there are systems out there that are being developed to help to make that happen in procurement. But if we want it to happen in Wales, as I say, the first thing we have to do is redesign the menus. And the second thing we have to do is look at the infrastructure and the training of the staff. And then, you know, food in hospitals and schools could become something that we celebrate, not something that we moan about. How are we doing for time, Tony?
Yeah, it's about right, actually.
Is it all right? Andrew?
Yeah, okay. It's been so interesting, Simon, listening to you, and just to let you know, you've some fantastic comments coming through, thanking you for your talk this morning. I think we probably will close off our webinar now, and I'll probably just have a few words with those on the webinar. But thanks very much for your time, Simon, very much appreciated. And hopefully we can catch up at some point. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity, and I'm sorry about the technical issues at the start, but they were nothing to do with me.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Tony, if you can disconnect your end, then I can close the webinar online. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for.
Cheers. Okay, guys, thanks very much for, let me just see where we are for a moment. Okay, thanks very much for your attendance. Apologies that did run over a little. Let me just put my slide back on there. That, I suppose, really is an example of a cohort day. We will invite along guest speakers occasionally to provide expertise on a particular topic, and in addition, of course, the participants this afternoon will be working hard on the particular challenges that they've brought to the programme. So please feel free to contact us. Contact details are on the screen. We'd be very keen to speak to you and your colleagues about participating in the CAPE programme. And thank you very, very much for your attendance and your enthusiasm. Hopefully speak to you soon. Bye for now.